Here we go. Hi there, and welcome to another episode of All Around Azure. I'm your host today. My name is Jason Hand. You can follow me on Twitter at Jason Hand. Really excited to be here today talking with my good friend Brandon Minnick, which I'll introduce here in just a moment. But what we're going to be talking about is how to create your first serverless API. And we're going to be doing that using Azure Functions along with .NET. So without further ado, let's bring in our guest here. Say hello to Brandon Minnick. Hello, Brandon.
Hey, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great. Great to have you on the show here. And let me just remind everybody who might be watching that I'll be paying attention to the chat. So if you've got any questions for Brandon or myself, just drop those into the chat there, and we'll try to get those answered to you. There may be a few links that we're sharing along the way as well, so I'll drop those into chat if there's something that Brandon's brought up in terms of documentation or anything else related to what's going on. But yeah, Brandon, let me tell us a little bit about what your plan is today. What are you going to share with us?
Appreciate that. Yeah, so my background is in C# and .NET, and actually I'm a mobile developer. So my expertise is actually with iOS and Android apps, specifically in C# using Xamarin. But every most mobile apps also need some sort of cloud backend, because eventually you're going to want to save that data to the cloud or share data amongst your users. And so these APIs become pretty, well, I guess I was about to say critical, but pretty important to learn, even for us mobile developers. And so I wanted to share with everyone today how to do this using a serverless backend. So in our case, Azure Functions, and also just how quick and easy it is to set up that, even a mobile developer like me can do it.
Awesome. Well, this sounds great. Maybe we'll just switch over to your screen and you can kind of start showing us a little bit about what you have for us. So switch our scenes here, get started. All right. So you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. So let's see. As we're going through this, we'll chat a little bit more about what serverless is. Not right now, Magnet. And but first, what we'll get started doing is just how do we create a serverless Azure function? And the easiest way to do that is just here in the Microsoft portal. So I cheated a little bit, but if we just go to portal.azure.com, then we'll get redirected to our dashboard. And once we have the dashboard loaded, there's this little create a resource here in Azure. So if anybody's never played around with Azure before, Azure calls everything a resource. So if we were to create a database, well, that's a resource in Azure. If we were to create if we wanted to create a virtual machine, that's a resource. So in this case, we're creating a function. So we'll go ahead and search for that, and we'll spin up. There it is. So we have our function app, and we'll tell it to create a new one. And then we just have to give it a little bit of details about what we're going to be doing. So you can select your Azure subscription. And the first thing I'll do here is create a new resource group. So like I mentioned, Azure calls everything a resource. And a resource group is just a folder for your resources. So it's just a way to stay organized. I like to think of it as like a folder on your desktop where you can put anything in it. So in this case, any resource can go in it. We're going to be using it for functions, but for example, the apps I have in the App Store, I create a resource group per app. So I have a app in the App Store called Get Trends. In Azure, I have a resource group called Get Trends, and that's where I keep the serverless backend for it and all the other things that I have in the cloud that support that mobile app for things like push notifications too. So let's go ahead and create one here. Let's call it my first serverless function. And you can name it whatever you want, but the name here actually matters, because when we name our function, and let's go ahead and let's bump that up a little bit. So when we name our function, if I name it something generic, it's going to yell at me and say that the app name's not available. That's because this name of our function, of our serverless function, is actually the URL that Azure uses. So somebody already created one called test, which gets the URL test.azurewebsites.net. So let's see if my first serverless function, serverless function, see if that exists. All right, cool. And then, like we mentioned earlier, I love .NET. My background's in C#, so we'll select the .NET Core runtime, and that all looks good. We'll keep it. And region is also just where the data center is. So the server has to live somewhere, even though we're in the cloud. And so we can choose from any data center around the world, but we can keep it on the default today. And once I click create, now Azure is spinning up all the resources. So it's actually carving out some space on a server in the cloud, specifically in that US data center for my Azure function. So while that's going on, Jason, I thought now would be a good time to chat about what even is serverless. So I know.
Yeah, let's go back to, because actually I wanted to tell you, I didn't want to break your stride there, but for some reason your camera has hung up. I've been troubleshooting on my end. I can't get it to come back to life, but we see your frozen face, which isn't a problem. But there we go. So, now you're live again. Okay. Yes, perfect. Okay. So yeah, sorry, what was your question there?
So yeah, pretend like you've never heard of serverless. What comes to mind when you hear this word? Because it's a buzzword that everybody's saying in the community nowadays, like totally. Serverless this, serverless that, microservices.
Right.
And I know you are familiar with them. We've talked about it before, but what comes to mind when you hear that?
Well, I think the first thing that you think about, or maybe a lot of people who haven't been introduced to these things and haven't had conversations like you and I have, serverless obviously implies that there is no infrastructure, or there's no server of some kind, right?
No server,
and which just simply isn't quite the case. But it does still, leave a little bit, even if you understand that there's got to be a machine somewhere, there's a server someplace, like it's not serverless, right? It still leaves a lot to the imagination of what does it mean, and I've talked with other people about how logic apps fall into serverless, and how even Power Automate and just a lot of software as a service almost types of things fall into that serverless category. And so it is a little bit of a misnomer and a confusing term. So I would love to hear your take on the term serverless and how you describe that to a lot of people.
Totally. Yeah. And I had the same reaction when I first heard it, because I've been doing programming, developing for 10, 15 years now. And I had the same reaction. I was like, well, the code has to run on a server, so that can't mean that there's no server. And probably the best description I've heard of serverless is actually to flip it around and call it less server.
Like that.
Yeah, so the server's still there, but the big differentiator between, or when it comes to serverless, is your code isn't running 24/7, or your server isn't running 24/7. And what happens with, in this case, Azure Functions, is when we create a serverless API like we're doing today, Azure will actually take the code for our API and save it to a file. And if nobody's using our serverless function or our serverless backend, then it's not running. And it's not until our backend is triggered, and we'll check out a list of all the different triggers that can wake up our functions. But one of them is an HTTP trigger. So if it's like a get API, a set, what are they? Get, delete, post, update. We can create APIs like that, and those would be an HTTP trigger that quickly, when those happen, Azure quickly takes our code, spins up a server, and runs our code on a server. So the upsides and downsides of that are, to me, the biggest upside is cost. So for example, the mobile apps that I have in the App Store, I just make them for fun. I love coding in my spare time. Love working in open source, and I don't make any money off of them. So to have a backend in the cloud to support them, well, that costs money because cloud providers like Azure charge you for basically CPU cycles, memory usage, data input and output. So if our code is running on a server 24/7, we get charged for that server cost. But what's nice with functions is because they're not running 24/7, we get what's kind of, we'll say, called in the biz micro billing. So we're only charged when the code's running, and the code only runs when it's triggered or when our function's woken up. And so one of the reasons I love functions is as a we'll say an independent developer who creates apps on the side that we'll say I haven't made any money off of them. I can have a whole backend in functions that I think my biggest bill for Azure Functions so far has been less than 10 cents. So less than 10 US pennies per month. And
it takes I've
got a couple thousand active users.
Yeah, I mean, it takes the core benefits of cloud computing, the economies of scale and the consumption-based model of only pay for what you're using. It takes it, down to even the smallest micro level of you really are only paying for when people use the code that is, part of the application or the service. The question I always have, or a lot of people also I think I'll have, is, well, that's cool, but I've never come across a server or any kind of machine that doesn't that can wake up super fast. So
right.
What do you have to say about the time that it takes for something to wake up? Because that feels like that's maybe a concern for some people.
Exactly. So that's what I would call the catch, right? Basically what we're talking about today is serverless functions that are, for all intents and purposes, basically free. 10 pennies a month. I can afford that, no problem. But yeah, the downside is because the server's not running 24/7, which allows us to save on cost, it also means there is some loading time or wake up time. And that's what's known as a cold start in the cloud. And so for my apps, I've found it's gotten better. The team's constantly working on improving the cold start times, and they've got even more, we'll say, aggressive goals for the upcoming year to get the load times even shorter. But since I started using them a couple years ago, I see about between anywhere from half a second to the longest I've seen is 3 seconds, but I haven't seen that in a while. And I'd say on average, it's about a 1 second startup time for my experiences personally.
Really, that's not too bad.
No, and that's the trade-off, right? For my mobile apps, I just have to be aware of that. And something I do when you launch my Git Trends app, for example, I have this animated splash screen. So, I kind of stole that, or we'll say was inspired by the same idea that you see when you launch the Twitter app. You'll see the Twitter logo explode, and then the app shows, or then the app displays the data. Or same on the Uber app, it'll kind of pulse the logo while it's loading data in the background. And so I just basically use that as inspiration. And when you launch my app for the first time, I had this little animation going where the logo is pulsing, and I'm sending some text underneath it that says, downloading data from servers or whatever it says. And it's during that time when the app hits the Azure functions and pulls in all the data. So as long as you are aware of it, then you can still create a pleasant user experience. Now, you don't want your user just staring at an app that's, for all intents and purposes, frozen. It's doing stuff in the background, but nothing's actually happening. You want to at least make it engaging, give them something to look at, let them know what's going on. And that's going to be the trade-off. So can you make a way to, can you work it into your apps so that 1 second load times aren't a big deal? Go for it.
Yeah.
But I can totally see a scenario where you might be doing something that needs real-time updates. if I was creating a game that would push real-time updates to multiple users based on one user's input, then yeah, that 1 second delay is going to cause some serious lag. So would functions be a good choice for that? Probably not that specific case, but for me, for most of my use cases as a mobile app developer, yeah, 1 second for essentially free cloud services.
Yeah,
I'm in.
Yeah, totally agree. Especially if you're really trying to, in early development, maybe creating an MVP, some sort of proof of concept, and the cost is just hard to beat. So let's hop back over and see if we can keep your camera alive while we're looking at your desktop here. And okay,
so I'll go ahead and share my screen again. I think that's when the camera died last time.
Yeah, but we're good now. So
all right.
Excellent.
Stuck to this face.
Actually, let me switch to a different one because I'm just gonna put us on the right hand side of the screen here so that we're not covering up too much. But go for it.
All right. So yeah, Azure is done creating our first function here. So it is actually pretty quick. It only took a couple seconds, but we were having such a good conversation, so figured didn't want to cut that off. But right now that we have our first function app created in Azure, now we can start creating our first API. And there's a couple different ways to do this. So we're going to start off today in the browser, and then we're going to, so I'll show you how to create a API in the browser because honestly, it's super easy. So why not show it off?
Yeah, love it.
But there's also some downsides. And so we'll jump over to Visual Studio to create or maybe just to recreate this one using Visual Studio and taking advantage of the tooling and the debugging and all that fun stuff too. Okay, so I mentioned there's a bunch of different ways we can wake up our serverless apps, and we'll be doing HTTP triggers today, but there's also things like timer triggers. These schedule a function to kick off based off of a, Jason, are you familiar with cron or a cron job?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cron. Yeah.
So
crons that's part of the ops tool belt, man. Everybody knows how to write proper cron job.
Yeah. So if you haven't heard of cron, it's actually just short for chronological. But basically, you can put in a timer, and I think it came from the Linux world. At least that's where I first used it. And you can basically say, run this script every hour, run this script every 5 minutes, run this script every Tuesday at 7:32 a.m., whatever you want. And so the same idea powers these functions. So I personally use these. I do some database cleanup. So one of my apps allows, it's a game that users can guess, and it's called Pun Day. So the app is these drawings, which are puns, and you try to guess what the pun is. And so because of that, I have to save the user's input, and about, I think once an hour, I have a timer trigger that fires that just checks the database, verifies the answers, cleans out any, we'll say like duplicate data, basically just doing some cleanup. And so I'm a big fan of timer triggers. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff like queues. So you can have functions passing data to other functions. So if this was we're going to just do a get API today, but maybe we're doing a post where we're adding some data. Well, that data can be placed on a queue, and then other functions can be listening to that queue and be woken up to handle it. So maybe there's another function that's listening to the queue to save that data to a database, or maybe we posted an image. So there's a function listening to the queue to take the raw image and then convert it into thumbnails. So you can do all sorts of cool stuff with functions, but we'll keep it easy today since we're just getting started. But we can always come back and we can keep building on top of all this fun stuff. So I selected HTTP trigger. And so let's just call this my first GET request. And this right here, authorization level, this allows us to basically set who can access this, right? So I'm just going to leave it anonymous, say anybody in the world can hit my API and access this, but we can always lock it down to only specific users if we wanted to use authentication and authorization too. And oh, that was nice and fast. There it is. So here is that function we just created. So my first GET request. And the way we can do this in the browser is just going to this code and test tab. And it created some stuff for us already. But honestly, this is a lot of code, a lot of stuff to look at. So I'm going to slim this down a little bit. And we're going to have this function or this API just return a string. So actually, let's keep this one line here. And let's change this to, hello, Jason. And so we'll save it. And then that's it. We just created an API. I can grab the URL here. And if I jump into something like Postman, which Postman allowed me to do a GET request. And so we'll say GET, there's the function we just created. So my first GET request, send. And there it is. It says, hello, Jason.
Nice.
And yeah, so we just created an API. It's serverless. And actually, if you look at the round trip time was only 600 milliseconds. So, we were talking about that cold start time. And yes, that happened, but the cold start time will vary. But like I said, the worst case I'm seeing now is like a second or just over a second. So still not too bad, and also pretty super easy to create.
Yeah, that was very fast.
So yeah, great. Like we did it, right? Like show's over. Let's go home. But the reason I don't typically recommend creating these functions in the browser is, we lose a lot of things that I love about writing code. So things like IntelliSense, things like a debugger, and we just don't get any of that here. And so like if I had misspelled result, and let's say I hit save, is it going to tell me? Or maybe we have to run it. Let's see. Let's call it again. There we go. And so now I'm left with a internal server error because I spelled a word wrong. And
Right.
I don't know about you, man, but I am really bad at spelling. Like my code is riddled with typos.
Well, not only am I a bad speller, I'm a bad typer sometimes, and I can tell you when I'm also not a great like coder. I've kind of alluded to, I'm more of an ops background, and so I think where you're going with this is super important, because for someone like me to jump in here and try to follow along, I got to have those squiggly lines and all kinds of things like telling me where I've made mistakes. So yeah, I think that's super important.
Same. And it's funny. Like I said, I've been doing C# for a long time now, and I've just become so reliant on like that little red squiggle in Visual Studio, or using IntelliSense to basically complete what I'm typing, right? That tab to complete. And it's funny, I've been teaching a friend of mine he's been an English teacher for, I think, 15 years now, and he wants to learn how to code. So I'm like, yeah, let's do it. It's COVID-19's going on. I've got nothing else to do. I can't leave the house. So he and I hang out for a couple hours every Saturday. And it's funny watching him because he's going through these tutorials in the browser. So he's using Codecademy. And in Codecademy, it gives you a challenge, and then it has you write some code in the browser. And I'm just watching him, and I'm like, I don't know how you're doing this, man, because I need IntelliSense. Like I would have typos everywhere, and missing semicolons.
I had that same problem with a couple different like online tutorials or little sandbox things where they don't have enough for me to stick with it, I guess, long enough to tell me where I'm going wrong.
Yeah. So right. So we can do this all in the browser, right? We didn't really leave the Azure portal to create our first API, and depending on what you're doing, this might be okay. Like I have a couple functions that I use in my mobile apps that just give me just return a secret, because my apps are totally open source. So I didn't want to hard code an API key or a a secret in the open source code. And so what I did was just to create a function and then I keep it there. So I literally have one line functions that look exactly like this in my production apps just to allow me to get that secret from the cloud. So this is still totally valid, but let's jump over to Visual Studio and we'll just start from scratch. We'll create a totally new solution here. And yes, I'm on my Mac, so I'm using Visual Studio for Mac, but similar story, similar journey for anybody following along on Visual Studio on the PC. So what we'll do here is we'll just go to New. And if you haven't before, you can scroll down to Cloud General, and then that's where Azure Functions live. So we'll go ahead and create a new Azure Functions project. And it's going to ask us what we want our initial template to be. So similar to the same journey we just had in the Azure web portal, we're going to be creating a new function here. So let's see, that was my first GET request. So maybe we create my second GET request. And right, so we can choose from timers, queues, blob triggers. There's even cool things. I don't think we touched on it, but like Cosmos DB is a NoSQL database. Mm-hmm. You can have that trigger and wake up an Azure function. So wow. Like if somebody, so if a user adds something to the database, we could have a function quickly check it, verify it, and handle that new input. And actually, now that I'm talking about it, maybe that's what I should be doing instead of a timer trigger for my database cleanup. But anyways, we'll stick to HTTP trigger for my second GET request. And let's also make this anonymous so we don't have to worry about passwords or authentication. And that looks good. All right, so this all looks pretty similar, right? Like we are, the code we're looking at here, I think this was the same code verbatim that I deleted when we created the one in the cloud. But now, if I misspelled result, because we're in Visual Studio, it's going to yell at me right away. And if maybe I don't know how to spell result, well, I can tab to complete. So we're back, right? And we can get all of the IntelliSense that we know and love. The other really nice thing about doing it in Visual Studio versus the browser, and I should give that caveat. Yes, I keep saying Visual Studio, but you can do this in Visual Studio Code. You can do this in Visual Studio for Mac. You can do this in Visual Studio on PC. All the Visual Studios. We can do debugging now. So check this out. Let's put a breakpoint here and run this and see what happens.
I've got a question. You're kind of running through some of the code editors we have. Have you used the code editor like in the shell, the Cloud Shell, and done it through that?
Cloud Shell. So Cloud Shell, is the Azure command line tools that you don't have to download, right?
Right. Well, if you go to shell.azure.com and if you've got, it doesn't matter what you have it in there, but if you go to shell.azure.com and then type in code space period, it'll launch Visual Studio Code in the browser.
What? I didn't know that.
Let's verify. I'm pretty sure.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so it's got a...
So yeah, get into one of your directories there.
And yeah, where do I click now?
Well, once it's brought you to the prompt, now just type in code space period.
What? I had no idea.
Kaboom. Yeah,
okay.
I haven't had a chance to play around with it either, but I don't remember where I heard about it. Someone brought it up again recently during build, I think. And but yeah, that's just another I guess editor that's out there that it's kind of cool to use.
Yeah, so yeah, this is impressive. I had no idea we could actually write code in Cloud Shell because when I haven't used Cloud Shell much, and there's a reason for it, but I recommend it to people because sometimes you're working for a company that like IT just locks down your laptop. They don't allow you to install anything. And yeah, if you wanted to do these Azure commands, so like you type in AZ whatever, and so I think that's actually where we could probably, is it AZ functions?
That's a good question. I haven't
AZ
actually
function.
tried to create anything using the AZ CLI.
Something like that. I've gotten it written down.
There's so many things to learn. Yeah.
Function app. There we go. But anyways, so yeah, we could create our whole Azure function here in the command line. And this is just a CLI that anybody can download and install to their local machine. And that's what I do because I have admin rights on my machine. So I can just install the CLI tools there. But yeah, some companies don't allow, like IT just doesn't allow you to do that. Or if you are a consultant or a contractor, then maybe you're working on borrowed machines or somebody else's machine, and maybe they don't want you to install the CLI. So if that's the case, no worries, because you could just go to shell.azure.com in the browser, and you have access to all the same CLI tools that you would have installed locally. So that's
exactly.
at least that's my excuse for not using shell.azure.com too much, but it is a great tool, and I'm really impressed.
As long as you've got a good, solid internet connection, it's actually been great for me. I've had a few problems when I just didn't have a great internet connection. But honestly, it is nice to be able to log into, a command line from anywhere through a browser and have all my stuff right there. It follows you all, wherever you are, just because it's all kept in storage. So anyway, I don't want to trip you up. So I'll let you get back to what you're showing us within Visual Studio, though.
Yeah, no, this is a great aside. I'm learning something new today. All right, so, interesting. That showed up in just the worst font to read. I wonder if
light blue on white. That's not hard for you to read.
Let's. Do I want to restart? Tell you what. Speaking of Visual Studio Code. Let's see if we can make that a little bit more legible. All right. So I just copy and pasted this. So what happened was, actually, let's jump back to Visual Studio for Mac. So what I did, I just clicked run. And when we run this function locally, it'll spin up actually using that CLI terminal commands. And what Visual Studio for Mac did here for me was to launch the terminal in Visual Studio, but obviously we can't read that. I can't even read it, and I'm looking at it up close and personal. So just brought that over here to see what it's saying, because in here it should be telling us where we can find the API running locally. So initializing, starting, and there we go. So it says that this API is now running on my local host. And if everything works properly, I should be able to punch this into Postman, say get. Oh, and we hit our breakpoint. Boom, look at that.
Sweet.
So now we're running this function locally, and we're debugging it so I can see things like, I don't think I passed in a name. I probably should have read the boilerplate code to see what it expected. But okay, yeah, it wanted the query name. Had I passed one in, it would have picked it out. And then it'll respond back to us. But yeah, so that same debugging experience, IntelliSense, completion, red squiggles, compiler, all that stuff we know and love is still available to us for Azure Functions, just doing it in Visual Studio instead of the browser.
Yep, which is a necessity for me.
For sure. Same here. And so let's see. I let that complete. And oh yeah, the response yelled at me. Let's see if I say name equals Brandon. How about now? Name Brandon. There we go. So just more proof that our debugging expertise is amazing. And then it says, hello, Brandon. Oh, such a nice function. All right. So we've now created our second GET request, but it's still only running locally. This doesn't exist in the cloud. If I went back to our, let's go ahead and jump out of there. So yeah, if we jump back to, we can discard those changes. That's fine. So right here, it shows we still just have the one function in the cloud. So that's my first GET request. And that's because my second GET request just lives right here. So what do we do next? Well, we can just say publish to Azure. And let's see. Look at the typos already. Microsoft.com. Hopefully I got everything right. Still looking good.
It's our four-factor. It's our four-factor testing. I do multiple times a day.
Oh, no, right? The good news is we are protected. Microsoft makes us log in a lot. Okay, so there we go.
Yeah, understatement. But it's good. It's good,
right. Though. So let's just jump back. So now that we are signed into Visual Studio, when I say publish to Azure, Azure or Visual Studio is now querying Azure and saying, show me all the resources that already exist. And this might take a minute for me because I have a lot of Azure resources. I'm that guy that forgets to delete a resource when he's done.
Do you clean your room?
Hey, I make the bed every morning.
That's important. I've heard that's an important thing.
Oh, man. So it's still searching, but let's go ahead and just, let me click create a new one. Nope, because it's still searching. Well, let's give that a second. And if it takes too long, we can work around it. But sure. Jason, do we have any questions in the chat?
That's a good question. Let me check over here. So far, I'm not seeing any. But yeah, I'd like to encourage. We got a lot of viewers, so and I'm assuming you can all hear us and see us just fine. So if you got questions, definitely throw them into the chat. Is there any other resources, I guess, while we're waiting on this, that you think might be useful for people? I know we got a lot of stuff in Docs. There's some really great Learn courses, Learn modules.
Yeah. And speaking of which, I put up a, what was the link to the page I put together? Do you have that handy?
I
put a link on my own website. I can't remember the URL.
It's, wasn't it Azure or Functions in Net or something like that?
Let's give it a shot. 404 not found. Let's see. We can figure this out because I use this handy dandy tool called Ghost to publish stuff to my blog. So
and
Azure Functions and .NET. So close.
Oh yeah, my memory's just off a little.
And we'll just click View Post. There we go. So yeah, what's cool is there's we'll call it new. It's still pretty new. I think Microsoft Learn's been around for about a year now. And there's a whole course in Learn for serverless. And let's give this a second to load. There we go. And so what we have here, and actually, let's see if we can say Microsoft Learn serverless functions. Create serverless applications learning path. Boom. So, all right. Just want to make sure it pops up at least in one of the top search results, just in case folks didn't memorize any links. But yeah, what's cool with Microsoft Learn is it's totally free. So you know me and how much I love free stuff. With Microsoft Learn, they have taken all the learning materials and brought them together in Microsoft Learn. And they've done it in a way that actually makes it really easy to consume because, for example, you can see this figuring out Azure Functions course is 7 hours and 10 minutes. And I don't know about you, Jason, but I'm not sitting down for 7 hours and 10 minutes and just devoting a day to this. I don't think I even have the attention span to do that. So
I've been through a lot of these learn modules, and they're awesome. But you're right, some of them do. You got to carve out some time.
Yeah,
and,
but
they're easy to stop and start though.
Exactly. Yeah. So yes, there's 8 modules, and yes, if we did it all straight, it would be about 7 hours. But each of these modules is broken up into more bite-sized tasks. So like this, choose the best Azure service to automate your business process, 44 minutes, or creating service logic, 36 minutes. And then even once we drill into each of these modules, each module is made up of units. And so scrolling down, we can see what I meant when I was saying earlier that this is all just bite-sized digestible material, because if I'm on my lunch break, no, I don't have 7 hours, and I probably don't even have 45 minutes, but do I have 5 minutes? Yeah. So we can come in here and learn about serverless computing, see how it fits for our applications, read all about it. And when we do that, whoops, let's go ahead and jump back. What's cool is it'll also save our progress. And so next time I get a free minute or two, maybe we're in a meeting that ends early and we get 15 minutes. Well, I can jump back in here and go to the next exercise. And what's also kind of cool about this is, let's see. All right, so it's walking us through. But oh, there it is at the top. So we can actually do stuff in what they call a sandbox in Microsoft Learn. So Azure, if you create an account, Azure basically requires a credit card. Now, not everything costs money on Azure. There's for almost every resource in Azure, there's a free tier. But with Microsoft Learn being totally free, and you don't even have to sign in to use it, what's really cool that they did was they allow us to activate, they call it activating a sandbox. And I'm not sure how long that'll take to spin up, but it'll allow us to actually write code in our browser and basically inside of Microsoft Learn. And it'll allow us to do what we just did in the portal. So we can create a function and we can do all of that without necessarily having to create an Azure account just to learn about it. So yeah, it looks like that's going to have some loading time too, which seems to be a theme today. But not only will it teach you how to do everything, it'll also allow you to actually do it and step through it while it kind of guides you along the way, which is pretty cool. This is
Learn.
Honestly, I'm impressed that Microsoft made this all free.
I know. Yeah,
somebody's using money somewhere.
It's Microsoft. It's also fun. Like the gamification. I don't know where you're at, but I'm up to level 8. With like 60,000 points or something XP, which is nowhere near some of the people on our team who have done all of them, or at least at one point. There's always new modules being added, but yeah, there's a couple people on our team that have been able to do them all, which is really, really impressive.
Yeah, I'm only at level 6, and I thought it was cool because I actually earned a trophy. Because you can get a badge for completing a module, but if you create the whole workflow, then you get a trophy. And I did all the Xamarin ones, and I thought I was cool. But yeah, man, you're level 8.
I got to 8. Honestly, I'll be honest. I mean, when I was touring with in Microsoft Ignite the tour, that was I did a lot of them to kind of fill time at the airport or wherever else. Sitting there idle. But also as I was preparing for the AZ900 exam, the certification exam, there's an actual learning path that's, and I'll find the link and I'll put that if I can in here too, that prepares you for that, for that specific thing. So anyway, just out of necessity, I went in and did a lot of the learning modules. And I mean, if I hadn't, I definitely wouldn't have passed that certification. It was, it was one of the easier ones, I think, but it's not, you can't just show up and take it and expect to pass.
I've been using Azure for 5 years now, and I'm I'm honestly terrified to take a certification exam because I don't know if I would pass it without.
Well, you now know that you can access Visual Studio Code from Shell.
That's right.
Cloud Shell. Hey, also, I want to be mindful of our
Yeah.
time. I know we're going to come up on time pretty quickly here. So, is there
Right.
other than waiting on this thing? Oh, it looks like it's done. Okay, great.
Yeah, we'll do the grand finale here. So let's go ahead and let's see, drop it in. There's me, this group. We'll put it in the same resource group. We'll use the existing plan. So basically, these are just the menu options that we saw earlier in the portal, but now they're presented to us here in Visual Studio. So we could create a new resource group if we wanted to, a new service plan, but we'll just piggyback on what we already created. And yep, just use that existing one. That's cool. And so that's basically it. I just said right click publish, and I pointed it to the resources we created in the browser. If we had not created those resources already, then we could have just done it right here in Visual Studio, which is really nice. And looks like things are succeeding, so that's good. Give it a couple seconds. Now, here's something else that's another benefit, right, of using Visual Studio. Yeah, we get all the debugging support and we get the red squiggles, but what also happens when we use Visual Studio is because we're doing it in C#, and C# is a compiled language, Visual Studio will compile our code and only send up the output. So in this case, I think this is a .NET Core project. I forget exactly what it outputs. Maybe it's a DLL. But basically, it just sends up that file to the cloud. And the advantage of that compared to the browser is when we did the code in the browser, that code gets compiled at runtime. So it just lives in the file as C# code. When the API gets triggered, then what Azure has to do is quickly compile that code and then run it. So also by using Visual Studio, we get to save a step in that process. And it's because it's already compiled, hopefully we'll see some faster response times. There we go. So it looks like it succeeded. All right. And let's check this out. If we go back to Azure, we hit refresh. If I did everything right, refresh. Oh no, where's my second one? Let's see. My first, let's refresh this. Refresh. Could have sworn I put it back in the same place.
I do this a
well,
lot too.
Oh, I put it in a new one, my second GET request. Whoops. Tried to move too quickly. Let's see. Oh, I just saw functions. There it is. Da, da, da. My second GET request. So I meant to put it back in the same spot as this first one. But anyways, here it is. And the difference we'll see here is when I go to this code tab, it won't let me write any code because this was all configured ahead of time. So I can tweak this this JSON file, which is like a configuration file, but I can't actually input any code. But just like we did last time, I can get the URL, type it in here, and there we go. 300 millisecond response time, not too bad.
It's real good.
And our function executed correctly. And if we, let's do JSON this time. Get something new. Hello, Jason. There we go. So yeah, with just basically a couple clicks of the mouse, we now have an API running in the cloud. This can be accessed anywhere. If anybody's following along, you too can enter this same URL into your browser and access this API. This is live, and it only took a couple mouse clicks, which is pretty cool.
So, Brent, in the time that we have left, which I think is just like a minute or so, what would be like the next thing that we do if we get together again? Let's say down the road, make some time to continue this conversation. I know it kind of it depends on the project, what we're building, but what is the next step, I guess?
Yeah. So now that we know how to basically publish our code to the cloud and get it running as an API, we could do a couple things. Like probably the next easiest thing to do would be to do that scenario I was mentioning earlier, where I use it I use functions to store secrets. So we could show how to set an API key as an environment variable, and then have the Azure function return that environment variable. We could expand on that, and actually we could do like a post request that takes in data, and we could connect this Azure function to, say, a SQL database to save that data. And so we can start really building out our backend system to support either our web app or our mobile app or whatever we're working on.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I'm putting a couple more links into chat, just some things that point to a few different resources. If anybody wants to continue learning more about these, Azure functions, in my limited experience with them, are super powerful, super fast, reasonably fast, super cheap, and I don't know, just fun, I think. I've got a few demos I use for various reasons that I've got some Logic app demos that are fun because you can do all kinds of stuff even if you don't know how to write a line of code. Functions, I've got some demos that do that because then you kind of take it to the next level with customization on some of the things, based on the language of choice, of course. But I think they're worth looking at for sure if you are if you're a developer and trying to look to save some money, especially on the front end when you're trying to just come up with some cool ideas. So
definitely.
Anything else before we wrap up?
That sounds good. I'd love to come back. We can keep building on top of this. And I've got to run because I'm heading to another stream.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to follow along with me, I'll be on Microsoft's Learn TV, where I co-host a show called 92 and Pike. And so if you want to come join me, I'll see you there in a couple minutes.
Yeah, sounds good. And definitely go check out Learn TV. Brandon will be over there with our good friend Chloe, and should be an awesome episode. So anyway, thank you so much, Brandon. Follow him on Twitter at The Code Traveler. I'm Jason Hand, at Jason Hand on Twitter. This has been another episode of All Around Azure, and thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you again real soon. See ya.